All right. Let's continue this. We left off with the thermal environment. All right, so we're talking about adaptations. We started this off with the whole idea of the law of tolerance, right? Victor Sheldon. Where organisms can't live everywhere. They have to live in the zones which they can tolerate. All right, one of the aspects of this law of tolerance is temperature. They have to reside in a temperature range where they can survive, they can tolerate it. And we're moving to the adaptations part, because we said some adaptations are just to get up and move, avoid it, all right? Develop some way to have a resting stage. But we also have adaptations that allow them to adjust their tolerance zones so that they can remain in that same area and tolerate the changing conditions. So we started with temperature. We started with the thermal environment, all right? And this is where we left off. In order to better understand the adaptations, we have to know how heat moves. Heat is that thermal energy. That's going to be what gets transferred. So we could have transferring through conduction, so two bodies in contact. We've got transfer through convection, the transfer of heat to a moving fluid, either liquid or gas. We have transfer through radiation. All right, so you're not in contact. And then you have a cooling, which is evaporative cooling. And we said usually it's water, usually that's what organisms use to cool, but it doesn't have to be. And I said alcohol, you put alcohol on your hands, you rub it, you'll feel your hands get cold. That is evaporative cooling. So I asked you why evaporative cooling costs energy. What'd you come up with? That's where we left off on Monday. It takes energy for our sweat glands to produce sweat. So, yeah, what we're going to have to do, our body has to figure out a way to move the water across the membrane. And they usually do that by setting up your salt gradients. All right? Pumping salt against its own gradient to encourage water movement out. All right? So it's not only costing water, but it's also costing energy because we have to move that water. We have to create the conditions that allow the water to move. And you'll see that some of this other aspects of this cooling also cost water or cost energy because of muscle movements. And we'll talk about those. All right, so now that we know how heat transfers, let's talk about the organism. Our organism wants to maintain a specific heat content. All right, and our heat content of the organism, this H total, all right, is going to depend on the heat gained or lost through conduction, the heat gained or lost through convection, the heat gained or lost through radiation, the heat lost through evaporative cooling, and then we have two other terms to deal with. Metabolic heat production, so the heat gained just through the natural metabolic process. All right, our metabolic processes are not 100% efficient. So that excess energy gets lost as heat. The organism acquires that heat. All right, so metabolic heat production, always going to be a positive, always adds to our organism's total heat content. And then we have this last term, which is heat storage, H sub S. I'm going to say heat storage is basically the wiggle room for the organism. Some organisms have the ability to maintain this extra heat, in most cases for a short amount of time, and they function just fine, but it's temporary. They're storing that heat until they get to a place where they can then unload that extra heat back to the environment. All right? We present this because the organism wants to maintain that total heat content within certain limits. All right? It basically wants to be balanced in some way. So if you're in an environment that is hot, you're constantly absorbing this heat. The organism wants to lower that heat gain or increase its heat loss. If it's in a cold environment, all right, our organism wants to somehow acquire more heat, increase its total heat capacity, or limit the amount of heat that it loses. Make sure no one's emailing me with the saying that everything's working, hopefully. I think that's good. All right. So if H total is too high, so if this number is too high, the organism is going to try to find ways to lose that heat. If H is too low, organism is going to find a way to increase its heat. All right? So let's start with this first one. How might an organism lose extra heat? What's that? Yeah, okay. Yeah, do some more evaporative cooling. Sweat more. Pant more. All right. What if H is too low? How might they respond? Okay, move to a location where they can absorb more radiative energy. All right, so we're going to talk about some of these things in a little bit more detail, but there are some key points. Key points with this equation. Number one, metabolism always adds heat. Always. Metabolism is never going to take heat away. No matter what, we're always going to add heat, and it goes back to our thermodynamic laws. All right, our processes are not 100% efficient. That excess energy gets lost as heat, which the organism absorbs. Key point number two, heat is always transferred from areas of high heat to areas of low heat. All right? If you think about diffusion and stuff, right? It always goes from high concentration to low concentration. Same idea with heat. It's always going to go high heat to low heat. Third thing, the rate of that heat transfer is going to depend on the temperature difference between the two things that are exchanging heat. All right? So the larger the difference, the faster you will get heat transfer. As an aside, we take advantage of this in multiple processes, not to mention the brewing world. You try to cool boiling wort down as quickly as you can. The colder that water is that you pump through a cooling coil, the faster you'll cool it. All right, it relies on the differences. So for our organism, let's say use us, for example. All right, our average body temperature is about 98 or so. All right, you can go in over the last 100 years, you can probably see a gradual change in our average temperature at the human body. All right, but we'll say 98. All right. If we hang out outside, it's going to be maybe low 90s, mid 90s today. All right. We're not going to have a huge transfer of heat. All right. Our body temperature will be similar to the environment. Yes, we'll probably be sweating a bit just because we are adding heat via metabolism. All right. So we'll probably exceed that. But the transfer between us and the environment, or the environment and us, depending on what the temperature is, will be minimal. Change that to February, where it might be 30 degrees outside. We go out there, we're going to lose heat very quickly to that environment. Big temperature difference. All right? And our last key point is that evaporative cooling is the only way to cool down the organism. If the environmental temperature exceeds the body's temperature. All right? So think about that. Evaporative cooling will be the only way to cool down the body if the environmental temperature exceeds the body temperature. And we change it. I have ambient temperature T sub A and body temperature T sub B because we'll see a graph with those, TA and TB. All right. Why is it evaporative cooling? Why is that the only way? Well, you have to think, go back to the key points. Heat goes from hot to cold. Heat's transferred from hot to cold. If our organism is in an environment that is hotter than the body, that organism is always going to be absorbing heat from the environment. It's always adding to its H total, which means the only way that it can cool down, so it can't lose heat. All right, it can't dump heat back. The only way it can lose heat is through this evaporative cooling. All right, but that's going to cost us water. It's going to cost us energy. All right, we ready? All right, let's talk about the animals. Animal adaptations. All right, our homeotherms expend energy to regulate our temperature. So we've already seen homeotherms, we've seen poikilotherms. We've introduced you to those terms. You can reference this term back to an earlier lecture. All right, we're going to expend energy to regulate our temperature. And I have C graph here. So we're going to see this graph. We've got ambient temperature on the x-axis. We've got our basal metabolic rate on the y-axis. So what's basal metabolic rate? It's the energy usage of a body at rest. If we just sit there, I'd say like what you guys are doing, but man, your minds are actively working. You're frantically keeping up with the notes and so forth. Just stop, cool down. Whatever your energy usage is, that's our basal metabolic rate. All right? So we look at basal metabolic rate. It stays flat, nearly constant across a fairly wide range of our ambient temperatures. It's at that range where our organism does very little to regulate its temperature. Its energy balance or its heat balance is basically constant. All right, it's stable. We can say stable. This range is called the thermal neutral zone. We can define it as a range of temperatures where no additional energy is required to maintain a constant body temperature. All right, it's marked by our lower critical temperature and our upper critical temperatures. Now, what happens when we fall outside of that zone? Well, let's talk about the lower end. So if we find ourselves in a cold environment, our total heat content is going to be lower than what we want. So we're going to have to find ways to increase our heat production, our total heat content. What we can do is do mechanisms that increase metabolism, increase that heat generation. That's going to cost us money. So the lower we get, the lower the temperature gets, the farther away we are from that thermal neutral zone, the more energy we will be expending to maintain our body temperature. All right, that part makes sense. You can think of shivering. All right, shivering is a type of response. All right, just normal everyday movement. That's a metabolic response. We warm up when that happens. All right. We also, some organisms exhibit non-shivering thermogenesis. So thermogenesis, just generically, is heat production. All right. Non-shivering aspect of it is that we're not moving. All right. So shivering, our muscles are contracting rapidly, we're using energy, metabolism's going, proceeding, we're producing heat. Non-shivering, we're not moving. All right. We're not moving, but we're still utilizing heat. Or we're still producing heat. How does it happen? Well, with the non-shivering thermogenesis, those organisms that do utilize it will use brown fat to increase the heat production. And what they do is take that fat and metabolize it. Now, during the normal pathway, we're going to produce ATP, and then we're going to produce heat because, again, our mechanisms are not 100% efficient. With the non-shivering thermogenesis, what we're going to do is uncouple ATP production. So who's had cell bio? Got at least one. You guys talked about ATPases, right? ATP generation, setting up, yeah, sure. You took it. Might not remember it. All right, so the whole process of ATP generation, you're relying on gradients, membrane gradients with protons and stuff. What you're doing is uncoupling it. You're still setting up the gradient, but instead of allowing ATP to be produced, so ADP binding with your phosphates, all right, to produce that ATP, right? You're letting that hydrogen come right back, or the protons come right back, and you're producing heat in the process. You're producing even more heat. All right, so we can increase it. And this is going to increase your basal metabolic rate. Now, what types of organisms do this? The humans do it. We shiver, right? We shiver. What about non-shivering? What's that? Blubber is used for insulation. I'd have to double check those. See if they can do that. Do humans do it? Yeah, we do it. When do we do it? When we're babies. Babies have brown fat. Babies take part in non-shivering thermogenesis to help regulate their body. Rodents, some rodents will do this. Bats will use this. All right, produce the brown fat and then utilize it for thermal regulation. What if we're at the other end, though? What if we're hot? Why do we have that increase in the basal metabolic rate? Well, the only way that we're going to cool the body when we're outside of this zone, so we're assuming that at this point, the environment's hotter than the body. So to cool down, to try to bring our body temperature down, we'll take part in evaporative cooling. That costs water, that costs energy. And we already said, why does it cost energy? Because we're going to have to pump salts out of the body to promote water movement out of the body. So our sweat glands, we're producing a salt gradient. That costs energy. Panting in animals, let's say in dogs, all right, it's the same type of process. They're going to pump salts against its gradient to promote water movement, but for panting, we also have the additional energy of getting the rapid air movements across that moist surface. So the air movement's going to sap heat out of the body, all right, thereby cooling the organism. Birds have something similar. We don't call it panting, we call it gular fluttering. It's rapid throat movements to try to bring down their temperature. It's promoting evaporative cooling. All right, now I do have this last question on the graph. Can we relate this graph to the law of tolerance? Yeah, we can. We can. All right, so we're going to go with this graph. Our thermal neutral zone, that's our optimal zone. Organism's going to do great because it doesn't require any excess energy to thermal regulate. The energy that they have, that finite amount of energy that they have, can be used for maintenance and they can be used for reproduction. As soon as you get outside of this zone, our organism now has to divert energy from another purpose just to thermal regulate. Are they diverting maintenance costs? Probably not. Are they diverting the energy needed for reproduction? Most likely. So if you have less energy available for reproduction, our population is going to do less well compared to those populations that are in the optimal zone. So when we get out of this zone, when we are here and here, we are in our stress zone. Let's get our pen. OZ. That's our optimal zone. Here's our stress zone. And then, I wonder if I could change the pen color. Great. Let's mark this spot. Once we get out to these zones, our basal metabolic rate drops off. What happens at that point? What is happening at that point? Death. Our organism cannot survive any longer. Its body is shutting down. Basal metabolic rate drops until the organism dies. So, we've got the optimal zone, we have our stress zone. What's our last zone to contend with? Zone of intolerance, or IZ, right up here. All right, so we related it to the law of tolerance. And this is what we see. This is what we see. Questions? Now, not all adaptations require energy. Not all adaptations to manage the changing environment, the changing heat content, will require an increase in basal metabolic rate. All right. Some of these adaptations include insulation. So furs, feathers, blubber. You can say, well, blubber is energetically expensive. It is. They produced it, but they're utilizing that blubber for insulation. All right, so they produce the fur, they produce the feathers, and if they really need to increase their insulation, they get them to fluff out even more. Increase that gap between their body and the environment. They can alter size and shape. Like, hold on, altering size and shape, think about it. If you're hot, if you're done, I'm gonna say, when you're done walking across campus, 105-degree heat, you get into the building, you're hot. What do you want to do? Put your arms out. Spread out. All right? You've changed your shape to try to increase the amount of surface area that you have to dissipate heat to the environment, to the cool air in the buildings. When it's cold out, what do? Keep your arms in close. You're reducing your surface area relative to the volume. And again, in the hope that you are conserving energy, you're conserving heat. All right. Some organisms develop appendages that do just that. They allow themselves to dump extra heat that they produce. Elephant ears, big. You've got a lot of veins and blood flow in those things. They're there for a purpose, not just to hear you. All right. Behavior. All right. Behavioral movement, relocating when the environment changes. Now I say that, yeah, this is technically an avoidance strategy, but what if you change your orientation to the sun's rays as a way to gain heat or minimize heat? All right, and then color. All right, color can play a role, and it doesn't have anything to do. It doesn't really cost us energy at all. Questions? One adaptation that, again, didn't cost energy, but it evolved, is a countercurrent heat exchange system. All right, it's used in more places than just animals. But some organisms in, we're going to say, extreme environments have this type of setup where blood flow runs out to an appendage, and then as the blood flow returns, the artery and the vein run very close to each other. And that's going to permit heat exchange between the outgoing blood and the incoming blood. All right? So the countercurrent heat exchanger is defined as an arrangement of vessels such that the flow is in the opposite direction, maximizing temperature differential between the fluids and thus the heat exchange between them. All right, this is the process of the big breweries, large scales, use the countercurrent heat exchange system to cool down that boiling wort very, very quickly with minimal water. All right, so let's talk about this, how this sets up. 37-degree blood in the core body. It travels to the appendage. All right? Travels to the appendage. If we monitor the temperature, we will see the temperature of that blood drop. On the way in, the blood is cool and it picks up heat and it warms up. We didn't get it here. They're mislabeled. I think that was in the textbook errata. Is that they try to fix this. So ignore it. Let's see here. Just X those out. We'll leave the 21 there because it's going to warm up. Because it does this. Your warm travels here and it dumps the heat to the cooler blood. And along each point, this upper one is going to be warmer than the lower vessel. So you're always going to have this transferring of the heat. Now the question is, why? Why does it do this? And it goes back to those key points about heat movement. All right, heat's always going to go from high heat to low heat. And the rate of the heat transfer depends on the temperature differential. All right? And we can think about surface area to volumes. In these appendages, you have a lot of surface area in contact with the environment. You're going to have the potential for a lot of heat loss. But if you can reduce the temperature in those appendages, you can reduce how much heat is actually lost to the environment. All right, and this is where our countercurrent heat exchange system is. If we didn't have this, this appendage might be 37 degrees, might be the temperature of the core body. That's going to be a very large difference in the environment. A lot of heat loss happens, and then you're going to have cold blood coming back into the body. But with these counterflow exchangers, we are warming up the incoming blood, so there's not as big of a drop when it comes back to the heart, drop in temperature. And we're reducing our temperatures in those appendages. So overall, we conserve heat and we save energy because we don't have to heat up as much. We don't have to take part in that metabolic heat production to maintain our heat balance. Penguins are a great example. A lot of Arctic animals are great examples. All right, penguins have this in their feet. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but have you ever wondered, maybe, why penguin feet do not stick to the ice? So, I'm sure most of you have ice in your freezer. Right? If you grab an ice, sometimes ice cubes stick to your hand. You ever wondered why? The heat of your hand melted the ice just slightly to produce water, and then the water refroze, sticking the ice to your hand. It's the same idea with Ralphie sticking, Ralphie movie, tongue to the light pole. I don't know if you've ever tried that. It sticks. All right? Believe it or not, it sticks. Yeah, penguins, if their feet were hot, they're on that ice-cold ice, super cold ice, they would stick. But with a counterflow heat exchanger, their feet are actually pretty darn cold. You're not going to melt any part of that layer of ice. You're not going to get sticking. Animal benefits because they're not stuck in one place, right? But they're also conserving heat, conserving energy. Countercurrent heat exchanger. Where do we also see a counterflow exchange system. So this is in terms of heat. Where else do we see one of these that's unrelated to heat? Think in the human body. Think an organ system. I'm hearing whisperings. Who's had anatomy? Nobody? Who's had physiology? Nobody? Who knows what a kidney is? What does a kidney do? Hold on. Share. What does a kidney do? What's that? Okay, filters the blood for what? What's it doing? What's its role? What does the kidney produce? Oh, what? The blood flow comes in, right? Goes around, gets filtered, goes back out. Blood goes back out. Urine. What is urine composed of? You're going to have to remember this because we haven't made it to water yet. But it's composed of water, right? All right. How does our body generate that water? The kidney does it. How does the kidney do it? How does the kidney reabsorb water? Through one of these counterflow exchange systems. It sets up salt gradients in the kidney themselves through our loop of Henle so that the water can flow down its own gradient. Same type of system. In that case, we're focusing on water concentration, salt concentrations in our blood. So make a note of that. We'll talk about it again. We'll talk about it again. All right, what about plants? I'm going to say plants are uninteresting. No, not really. They can be cool, the right ones. But, in terms of, thermal adaptations, it's not as cool as a lot of the animal adaptations. I'll tell you that. So one of the main ones for plants are the avoidance strategies. They produce seeds. All right? Seeds can last through the winter. All right? Some of the plants, the perennials, they go dormant. All right? They avoid the harsh conditions. They basically shut down, and then when conditions improve, they ramp things back up. All right, those are common ones. We've mentioned them before. What other ones are out there? But we do have some morphological adaptations. And I think I know at least in that first week of lab, I talked about some of these. So believe it or not, some of the plants have morphological adaptations that allow them to alter the heat gained or lost through radiation and heat gained or lost through convection. All right? And this is because plants can't get up and move. They're stuck. All right? So what types of adaptations affect the radiative heat gain or loss? Well, one, having shiny leaves. If you have a shiny leaf, you're going to reflect more of the sun's energy. You can reduce your radiative heat gain. Having a lighter color leaf can reduce radiative heat gain. Flip side, if you're in maybe a cooler environment, producing a darker color leaf will allow you to heat up faster. Your absorptivity is going to be better. Some of our plants can actually alter leaf orientation. They can change how the leaves are situated to better capture the sun's range. What's an example of a plant that can do this? Sunflowers, classic example. Sunflower tracks the sun. Flower itself tracks the sun. All right? It's altering its orientation to take advantage of this radiative heat gain. Some plants actually have vertical leaves. All right, so instead of having a leaf that's flat out and getting the light full on, all right, they have them more vertical. Try to minimize their exposure to the sun's rays. All right, and then we could come up with other ones. I'm just presenting these because they're easy to talk about, and I do think I talked about the leaf. I talked about the leaf color. Not sure if I did the shiny leaves or not in that first week of lab. What about the convective heat gain or loss? This is tied to the boundary layer between the leaf surface and the actual surface of the air. All right. So when you have the air movement through, it's going to hit the surface and you will get turbulent areas. All right. This is what we would call the boundary layer. All right. It's this turbulent area that lowers the flow, the airflow. And remember, convective heat transfer is transferred to a moving fluid or liquid. All right, moving fluid or liquid. Moving fluid, which would be gas or liquid. So if we slow down the flow and make it a little bit more turbulent, so let's say cut the speed in half, where we are reducing our convective heat loss. Now, this boundary layer serves another purpose because once we get this turbulent heat flow, the regular air that's flowing will hit this boundary layer and flow over the top. All right? So, golf balls, right? They have dimples. Why do they have dimples? I'm going to open this up to anyone watching YouTube. Why do golf balls have dimples? Make it more aerodynamic. Why? Why do they function? Yeah, why is spinning so important? So yeah, dimples make the golf ball go farther. Quite simply, why? This process. You get this cushion of air in the dimple itself that helps to allow the golf ball to cut right through the air. All right? This is the same process in a forest. All right? You just have to think this is like a very tiny micro scale. In a forest, you're dealing with trees. All right, the trees have all their leaves at the top, or needles if we're in a conifer forest. All right, you've got your airflow. Your wind comes down, it hits the top of the tree. All right, and that's about all it gets. That airflow is going to cruise across the top of the tree, so it could be blowing 25, 30 miles an hour out there, but down on the forest floor, we're going to feel very little air movement. Yeah, some air will come down, but we're not feeling that 25 to 30 mile an hour flow. So that idea, that process, plants can take advantage of it. Either have smooth leaves, which allow the airflow to get close to the leaf surface, or what I'll say, hairy leaves. So you produce structures, trichomes, right? Those who had botany, right? You produce these structures, you make them hairy, that would act kind of like a tree to produce this cushion, this larger boundary layer, which would minimize our convective heat loss. All right, so smooth leaves are good if we're trying to dump extra heat. All right, that's when you think about the leaves that are out here. Yeah, you see a lot of those, a lot of smooth trees, or smooth leaves, typical in hot regions. In cooler or cold regions, we're trying to minimize our heat loss. You tend to start seeing more structures, more roughness on the leaf, and also some hairier leaves. See, we can't leave plants out. They do have some of these adaptations. All right, questions? All right, we've got our quiz. All right, so our attendance quiz, it should have been posted. Did it post? Did I get an email for it? I think so. All right. Correct answers. Mike Wazowski. That's a correct answer. And Zed. What's that? Yep. Email me, and then I'll go into Blackboard and mark it. All right, we'll kind of wrap this up, because plants can also take part in thermogenesis. So we got those answers, those two answers. All right. I think this is probably the coolest of the plants, plant adaptations. Because some plants can actually generate their own heat. So as I said, thermogenesis is just generically heat generation. Okay? Heat generation through metabolic processes. So we uncouple ATP production and in the process produce more heat. If plants do this, it is usually tied or associated with their reproductive structures. All right? Flowers and flowering plants. And then you have to ask yourself, why? Why would plants do this? Well, it plays a kind of an interesting role. And it's tied to reproduction. I mean, if it's in the reproductive parts, it's going to be tied to reproduction. But some of these plants will produce the heat so that they can be pollinated and reproduce earlier in the year compared to other plants, compared to their competitors. All right, so the skunk cabbage. Here's one. It's one of the earliest flowering plants. It generates heat. You can see, this is snow. Smaller plant. This is snow on the ground. It's generating heat, melting the snow, so that it can flower and attract those early pollinators. When the pollinators come out, this is going to be one of the few things that's going to be available to them. All right? So it gives these guys an advantage over plants that might use the same pollinators, but flower at a slightly later time. In some cases, that heat is used in conjunction to attract a pollinator. All right, so some of these heat-generating ones, their aroma is putrid. Rotting flesh. What type of organism would pollinate that? Like a fly or beetles, carrion beetles, all right? Anything that's going to scavenge on this rotting meat, all right? So it's not just the smell, but the rotting meat, because it's rotting, is also producing heat. Decomposition is producing this heat. So coupled with that aroma, the plant produces the heat to help attract pollinators. Other plants might flower later in the year. They might do that late period, take advantage of the fact that a lot of the other flowers have already flowered and set seed and they're gone. So now these are later, but they run into a problem if we have an early freeze. So some of those plants will produce the heat to protect themselves during those periods of frost or a hard freeze, an overnight hard freeze. Is it necessarily worrying about the total heat content of the entire plant? No. They're focused on the reproductive structures when they do this thermogenesis. All right. Questions? We will stop here and we will pick up with water stress. Oh, yep. Good job, Paul. We had a question of, can I repeat the attendance answers? They got it. Mike Wazowski and Zed. I almost had bonus points for what two movies those came from. You already get enough. All right. Don't forget lab. This is Hardy-Weinberg. You're learning how to do the Hardy-Weinberg equations. Monday lab and Tuesday lab already went. We have Wednesday and Thursday. There's homework that gives you additional practice. this material is on the exam next week. All right? That Hardy-Weinberg stuff is on the exam. So what I'm going to ask, those in Wednesday and Thursday, and Michaela should say it in lab. I'm going to ask you Wednesday and Thursday to finish up that homework and bring it to me. You can drop it off to me on Wednesday. So that way then, I can post the key that everyone can see the key, look at their homework answers, and prep for that test. In preparation for that, there's a practice problem set available on Blackboard. I'm going to double check to make sure it is accessible. And I have this quiz, a Hardy-Weinberg quiz, that asks the same questions and has you type in the answers, again, to kind of check your work, to make sure you know how to do it. And I think on that quiz, it's unlimited attempts. So you can keep redoing it to give yourself more and more practice. Because again, this is going to be on the exam on Friday. All right? So that'll go live. I'll make that part go live this morning, even though I know Wednesday and Thursday hasn't taken it. And then you'll have until, through Tuesday to complete it, and then at that point, I'll make it go live. I will say that on that quiz, you're typing in your answer. You're typing in your allele frequencies and genotype frequencies. I think I specified 3 decimal places. All right? If you are confident you have the correct answer and you think it might be rounding, email me. So I will go in there and confirm that it is the rounding that's giving you a trouble. So don't freak out because you went to 4 decimal places and my key only went to 3. It's just one of those things with Blackboard and how they grade those types of answers. All right, so just email me, I'll check, and I can confirm, yeah, you did it right. You'll get credit for it. All right? All right. No, so the exam is this Friday? No, the exam is the week of September 20th. September 20th is Monday. Syllabus says it's next week Friday. Next week Friday. Right? It is. And I looked at grab online my syllabus. So yeah, next week Friday, which we probably could have had it this week, but it's next week. All right. Have a good day. See you all on Friday.